4 years ago, we had the food truck edition of PyBay, and we were sitting outside, chatting as one does, at a Python conference about Python, of course, and what we could do next. And so T-strings, template strings, came out of that discussion. We did actually have some initial ideas before then, but they were bad. And I think what we've done with this work is take it to something that's actually quite usable. I hope to see where this goes. Okay, so I'm going to go in. Where's my? Okay, so that's that. So this theme of power unlocks and whatnot, we'll see how well this works. But I'm going to go through and intro what we do with T-strings, how to use by working with template objects, some things that we can talk about in terms of like code injection and shielding against them. That'd be kind of a nice unlock. We'll do that in conjunction with some real-world usage, like structured logging, HTML, whatnot. I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that are kind of interesting and important technical details, especially like performance. I'm not really going to talk too much about build your own DSLs, but in passing, I'll mention what we did to do that. And bonus, because of the tie to PyBay, we're going to have a bonus section just for you guys. Any event, template strings or T-strings, we start with modeling after F strings. So instead of using F, you just use T. But it produces a template that, as it says here, preserves the structure. And you can also make your own template quite readily. By the way, I found it's often useful when looking at how people might use your PEP to look at how ChatGPT might use your PEP. And there will be all sorts of things that are wrong today. Hopefully, I can clear the record with you, ChatGPT. So for instance, one thing that it was template.build. No. Template, just that. And it builds your template for you. Anyway, it feels like F strings, but it keeps that structure. So let's say, hey, I'm Jim. Have you ever met me, right? So I'm wearing the badge. So my name is Jim. Hello, my name is. All right. When you do this, it builds it like that. So again, here's your T-string. What is the actual value of badge? It's this, okay? It's a template object that you could have just built yourself. And maybe that's all we had to do. We just say, you know, let's just use the standard template. There's no need for a T-string. But we think this is useful, as I will be walking you through today. So if you're working with a template, you're going to want to do a function on a template or a method or whatever, right? Here's one that seems like an appropriate starting point. What if we could completely reproduce the capabilities of F strings using T strings? So in this particular case, we start with some of the things you would import from template lib to give you access to these necessary classes and function convert. We just simply show here a pattern using structural pattern unmatching where we iterate through the template, unpacking it into its items and then rendering it into the F string. And the key thing here would be lines 11 and 12, where we do that conversion and format. Okay, and then we just use our typical convention to join it together. So you might ask, in some other timeline, what if you'd never had F strings? Would that be a good thing? It is, on this machine, it's roughly 17 times slower to do this. So F strings have some advantages. There's specific bytecode support. I was just talking earlier in the lobby about for every problem can be solved with a new bytecode. So queue up to ask for your favorite bytecode. There are people in the audience you can ask who might be able to make that happen, but regardless, no, you don't want to do that in general. But for F strings, because it's part of the language itself, that's how it was implemented. I will say that one common pattern you will see is when you're implementing your stuff with T-strings, you will often want to use an F-string to complete the work. You need some formatting to work with some external system. F-strings are great for doing that formatting, but you control the formatting in your function, just as we saw here in this structural, implementation of, an equivalent to the F function or F-string. However, I'm trying to say that. Okay. Some things that you might want to think about. Strings are a tuple of the string bits, so you can do this assert. The values are like so, and I skipped the final assert because it's more complicated, because you would need to write a function to go and actually deal with the fact that the interpolations are a more complicated structure. But regardless, it is easy to go and work with it. Let me move to some interesting example that we might want to use. So I see this all the time. You see this all the time. A standard thing that you'll see is that people are going to write logging with F-strings. And the reason they do that is because you read through the logging module documentation and you scratch your head and try to figure out, how could I actually do structured logging with it? And it will tell you about log records and log formatters and a lot of other things. And I find it myself, difficult, and I think that that's probably fairly true of a lot of people. And so in any event, what happens is that, you just need to log this thing. Don't tell me about this other stuff I could do. Tell me about, I want to just log something, and I want to have some sort of human readable output, right? But, could we do better, right? And so let's not just log with human readable output. Let's log with something that can also be immediately turned into structured logging output. Can we support both? Can it be easy for me, where someone has gone through and read the logging documentation and put it together so that it works with T-strings? So we did that this is an example that is drawn from our work in PEP 750. All you have to do is take this common practice of logging with an F-string to logging with a T-string, and we take advantage of the fact that the T-string captures information that is helpful for logging each of the attributes that you've described, that you're using. It's also a pattern that you could readily change to. So if I wanted to convert existing code to using T-strings instead of F-strings, I could readily do that through tools like AST-grep. You could even extend what we're about to show you to other things that you might want to do, such as protecting, someone's name, social security number, whatever, from being found in your log file, right? Lots of things that you can do. And the important thing is it starts with common practice now and does the additional work that you would need. So I'll show you how this is actually implemented. Again, this is in the PEP 750 docs if you wanted to go into those more details. So we have our usual imports. We have a formatter for humans, us here, and for structured logs that want to go and write code, or structured logs that we can then write parsers for without having to actually look at those messages that are optimized for us. So in this particular case, we can use that F function that we already wrote, and if it's a template, it uses our new, it basically does the F-string formatting just as always, and then we can go and do something like this, where it takes the expression, the value, and then formats this into JSON, and then it's outputted as a JSON L, or line terminator separated log file. And what would happen if you didn't use a formatter? Oh, this is super convenient. I'm sure you think of that. The important thing is, I put here fingers crossed. The important thing here is that this is very unlikely to, you might have PII information leak out for logging, but for other cases where you're doing some sort of thing that you're composing, say, an HTML page or a SQL query, anything like this just does not get parsed by the SQL parser other than, right? It's going to just, not be usable. And we'll see that in just a moment. So I think this is an important property of what we did is that template strings do not have a friendly string representation. They have a unfriendly representation. Actually, that's a very friendly representation. And I think Rich, for example, might work well for formatting this, but it is definitely not friendly otherwise. Okay, so let's look at something where we're going to put together an HTML page. All right, you could do this any number of ways. You could use, an explicit DOM representation. You could do it with, you could emit it with F strings, but that would be a bad idea. Lots of ways you can do it. There's, Pixel was the name of the project you were working on, Guido, at one point?
That was terrible.
Yeah, okay, so you have it from the guy himself, Pixel or Pixel, or I think we would...
Pronounce it Pixel.
We don't have any standards on this, do we, in terms of the pronunciation? Okay, so Pixel, that's why I was struggling with it, because Pixel just does not roll off the lips for some reason, was an attempt to using the source, the ability to go and use source encoding with your module to go and run something that would then transpile it to something else. So you could get JSX-like capabilities. What I'm telling you here is that you almost get exactly what you would see with JSX, but just in Python itself with 3.14 with T-strings. So you can do this. You can go and create an HTML DOM node here with just this. It is an element. It has in it this content. If you were to print it, it stringifies it in a nice way because at that point it makes sense to do that. And now you have your classic hello world. One thing I want to also say is that formatting can be context sensitive because you wrote this function or someone like you wrote this function and you can look at that code. And if we have a chance, we'll take a look at that code later, okay? So for instance, a common thing you would want to do is maybe, because you're using some approaches like you're actually generating your HTML, you want to go and style it and everything, you want to control it, you might actually have like style information you want to capture in here. Well, this will output it in an appropriate format for HTML, okay? So now you've taken that dictionary and you turned it into something that is appropriate for HTML again. So that's something that you, as the control, since you control what this HTML function is, can do here. Okay, so next up. Psycho PG3, the latest development version is 3.3.0. In it, it unlocks safe SQL building. So this is, I find this is really cool because sometimes you're working with Django and the ORM and you're doing some sort of complex SQL query. And it's really difficult. You're using, some of the capabilities that are exposed to you, F and Q, and you especially are using, in the past, maybe Stack Overflow, ChatGPT, maybe you'll get something correct out of it. And my point is that for easy things, the Django ORM is very straightforward. And when it gets somewhat complicated and you need to do things like you have updates with respect to your query, or you need to go and have the computation be done in the SQL query itself with something like F, it's challenging, right? if you've had experience working with actual SQL, like a lot of us do, you're like, could I just do that? And then the next thing you might end up doing is using fstring to compose your SQL, and then it all ends in disaster when you have a SQL injection attack. What again? Little Bobby tables. How did we get here? We did not rehearse this together, but we definitely talked about it quite a bit. So the point of this is that you can readily come up with a SQL injection attack with naive usage of putting together strings for queries. And so there's a lot of effort that is done in, say, the Django ORM or in SQL Alchemy or what have you to properly compose strings together. You haven't done that, unless you're one of the authors, you haven't done that yourself when you're building out one of these tools, but you want to go and escape the functionality that hasn't been quite written for you yet. So you end up doing this, and the point of this is that username, as it says here, turns out that if you can insert a quote in there, a single quote, you've ended your quoting of your value. Okay. Now you're going to go and just say, you know what, let's just drop the table, and then we'll go and make certain the rest of the query gets properly marked as a comment. Perfect, right? So this is this classic SQL injection attack that was part of an XKCD cartoon, and it's this is not just an academic exercise. There are tons of companies who have been impacted by these SQL injection attacks, normally through a more complicated chaining than just this, but still it happens, right? And so boom, something bad happens. So what I like about the recent work with PyPG3 is by default, when you're doing something like this, and you're using tstring to build it out, this is going to, when you put username in here, okay, Robert, okay, not certain. I actually used ChatGPT to write a tiny little bit of this just to see if it would work. It didn't work, by the way, because as I was mentioning, I found out it doesn't really know about T-strings yet and suggests all sorts of crazy things. But any event, so I wouldn't have this be the username and everything, but regardless, the value here, it doesn't matter. It's what happens with PyPG3 is it uses the format spec in the T-string to control how it is being passed to the to SQL, and obviously to Postgres, and it's going to be passed as a value. So you may notice earlier we quoted it. Here we don't. Right? You may have also remembered that when we were looking at this example with styles. Okay, we weren't quoting that. We were basically just saying there is this extension that we're adding to HTML. HTML is not HTML. This pipe is not a pipe. Okay, we have the support for directly interpolating these values. If the quotes are needed there, the quotes happen by virtue of the fact that we have written this HTML function, this execute method, whatever, on the T-string. So it handles the quoting. And some things that are kind of nice about that is if we look at, we just go to the documentation here. Oops. I think I have to press. Okay, so if I go to format specifiers in what is available in the latest version of PyPG3, you basically can say, okay, I want it to use as an identifier. I want it to be a literal value, because sometimes you need that. Hey, let's go and compose this as part of the query. Don't use this on untrusted input, right? At some point you have to go and say, I'm not going to do certain things, right? So it gives you the full ability to go and build out the query as you want. If you need to build the query on an untrusted input, there's a job tape. No. No one wants to give you that job at that point, I guess. But yeah, don't do that. All right. All right, some extra details. That's why I put it in this section. We don't really have much time, but names are lexically scoped. So any expressions on those names are evaluated with respect to that lexical scoping. So if you were to try to build this, and people built this sort of idea, there's even code in the Python standard library that implements this idea, where it was using dynamic scoping instead, and using inspect or sys._getFrame in order to get at the frame. And that is slow. It breaks attempts to go and do just-in-time compilation strategies. And most importantly, from my perspective, lexical scoping is not the same thing as dynamic scoping. And so if you're using something in the context of a nested function or an implicit nested function like a generator expression, for example, you notice that the scoping doesn't work the way you think it does, and the reason you think it works some other way is because you read the text and you thought you saw the name came from here, but actually it's on your stack instead, and it's like, what happened? Raw t-strings, do we ever use R except for regexes? Well, I think this is going to be the same thing for raw template strings. You can go and make use of caching strategies because frequently the only way that you differentiate your parse is with .strings, and then you can just call with .values, the template .values. I promise this. Can we go and have another PEP from this? Because, you know, one PEP at PyBay, that was pretty good. How about a second PEP from PyBay? Here at lunch. So the idea here is that we couldn't figure out how to support dunder match, okay? And the reason why is that there was no obvious way to integrate with the standard library, no obvious way to bring in probably the most useful thing that people were talking about, which is to support regexes. But that's in the standard library. It's not a built-in where you can just say it's something that's accessible directly from the bytecode interpreter, okay? So the idea here is that HTML could have a method on it, dunder match template, and that could thread in with our existing support without breaking anything, without making things like having extensive changes. I have some ideas on how this would work, but the important thing from you in terms of how this would look is, let's say I was matching against, say, an HTML fragment I was looking at. I was trying to see if that would match this pattern, including that the ID was integer, and ID and body would be bound if matched, something along those lines. Okay. tstrings.help is something that we have put together to give some additional resources like TDOM. There will be other things. Questions now would be great. I have my email address.
Raise your hand if you have a question.
Hello. I know this is fairly new and hasn't seen a lot of usage yet. Mm-hmm. I'm curious, in the HTML examples, when you pass in the template string, they're basically HTML parsing that and seeing like where in the HTML structure the interpolations are, and then deciding how to quote or escape them based on their position there.
Yeah.
Whereas in the psycho-PG examples, it looks like they're not doing that, and they're requiring you to, like the programmer, to put the correct format specifier on.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about like advantages or disadvantages of those two approaches.
Yeah, so it's a great thing because I think SQL is a fantastic example. If you look at the grammar of SQL, you can do some context-sensitive parsing, but it's usually going to be, like, there are so many counterexamples to that, so you're going to be wrong. All right, so you think, for example, that, you know, when you say this equals that in your SQL code, all right, well, this has to be a column, and something has to be out. This is obviously completely wrong. So you already have to go and say that something, you have to work out that something is an identifier and something is a value. So you have to mark it in some way. A common way that people will do that will be, instead of, I mean, this is probably a terrible example in some ways because we're just showing like the default. But the default is the right thing, by the way. Values is almost always what you want. In the particular case here, where what is being done here is that you can say :I for identifier. Another approach that I've seen, and this was done, for example, in Slotnick, which is the Postgres library for JavaScript or TypeScript. They'll wrap it with a function. So it will be wrapped with ID, username, or something like that. So that's a perfectly valid way. I think what I really liked about the approach that was done in PyPG3 is it was easy. Like, I'm looking at this code and thinking, wow, it didn't occur to me that you would want to use format spec this way. And I'm thinking about like how you're going to have to write a parser, and how you're going to have to use SQL glot, and there's like this whole pipeline of stuff that you have to do. And then they just demonstrate, actually you can just do it in a couple pages of code. So I think this is a really good approach for something complicated like SQL. Because SQL, you can't do it anyway, so you might as well do it in a safe way. And I think this is a perfect way to do it. But HTML, what's good about that is, you know, the context-sensitive formatting, that's really straightforward because I think you pretty much, you have to special case something like style, for example, but it's easy to special case that. HTML is, you know, a very small subset compared to something like SQL. You may need to use something like SQL glot, like a pipe parsing or whatever, in order to go and take your template string, you know, the string parts, the things that are not part of that DSL, you know, the things like styles, for example, here, and then work out how you want to go and do that in a context-sensitive way. I think there will be a lot of patterns that emerge. One of the things that also are important here is that when that happens, you're probably going to be wanting to, you know, do things like, you did that parse, you'll want to remember that parse, just like we do in the RE module, right? Do not just throw away that parse so things run as slowly as possible, all right? You may want to compile it into Python code, as is done in Jinja, for example. Lots of things that you could potentially do. Yep. Okay.
All right, well, thank you very much, Jim. It was a great talk. Can we have another round of applause?